The Assad regime's collapse marks a turning point in Syria's history as rebel forces led by Abu Mohammad al-Jolani, a controversial figure with ties to al-Qaeda, assume control. This seismic shift signals a major setback for Russia and Iran, longtime allies of Assad, while presenting the United States and regional partners like Israel with significant uncertainties. President Biden's cautious support for the rebel victory underscores the complexities of navigating a post-Assad Syria, where questions about governance, stability, and geopolitical balance loom large. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Brendan McGuire, North Texas President for PNC Bank and Board Chair of the World Affairs Council. Welcome to this afternoon's RealTime Report, an ongoing series designed to offer quick expert analysis on the biggest hot-button issues that occur around the world. We're fortunate to have with us today Ambassador David Satterfield, Director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy and former White House Special Envoy for Middle East Humanitarian Issues. He'll be in conversation with Jim Falk, President Emeritus and host of World Now. As members of our global community, you know that staying up to date with world events is crucial. If you're not yet a member of the World Affairs Council, please join us. We'd love to welcome you to our network of engaged citizens. For more information on membership, please visit dfwworld.org. And lastly, over our 70-plus year history, the Council has played a critical role in informing and educating our community on the most important matters facing our country and the world. Your financial support is extremely important for us to continue this mission. I ask for you to consider donating to our annual fund, which supports our work at this critical time in history. You can donate on our website, dfwworld.org, or by using the QR code shown on your screen. No amount is too big or too small. I will now pass it over to our moderator of today's webinar, Jim Falk. As I mentioned before, Jim is President Emeritus of the World Affairs Council, Dallas-Fort Worth, having retired in March 2021 after serving 20 years as our CEO. Now residing in Santa Fe, New Mexico, he is a member of the board of Global Santa Fe, where he chairs the program committee. Jim, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, and hello, everyone. Great to be with you, and congratulations to the World Affairs Council for pulling this together so quickly. And what an honor to have the chance for all of us to have a discussion with Ambassador David Satterfield. The ambassador is the recipient of the highest distinction awarded by the Department of State, and that is the Secretary of State's Distinguished Service Award. And given the critical role that David Satterfield played throughout his four decades of service, especially in the Middle East, I think we all agree that this recognition is certainly well earned. Ambassador, I was talking to one of your colleagues just a few days ago, and she described you as a legend, known for your ability to provide a credible defense of just about any policy without a tinge of partisanship. And she added, "This is the highest praise that can be accorded to a professional diplomat." Now, as Brendan said, the ambassador is the director of Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. And I want to encourage all of you to go to its website and sign up because they send out just great email newsletters on global as well as domestic issues. Of course, this institute was established in honor of the 67th Secretary of State, James A. Baker III. And I should also mention that the founding director is someone well known to many of you, Edward Dirigian. He was the founding director, as I mentioned. Among the many posts that David Satterfield has held includes ambassadors to Lebanon, Turkey, chargé d'affaires in Egypt and Iraq, and most recently, this past October, he was appointed Special Envoy for Middle East Humanitarian Issues with obviously particular focus on Gaza. In addition, he has had experience negotiating on issues ranging from the 1995 Roadmap for Israeli-Palestinian Peace, the withdrawal of Israeli defense forces from southern Lebanon, and as well, lastly, the 2008 Status for Forces Agreement between the U.S. and Iraq. And those of you who know me from Dallas, you will not be surprised that I'm also happy that he spent some time in Tunis, Tunisia. So, Ambassador, welcome, sir.
Delighted to be here, and let me add my voice in praise of the work of the Council. Across the United States, the Council does superb work, both in education and development. of new generations of leaders and providing informed dialogue to the people of the United States on critical foreign policy issues. I've worked with the Council for 40 years plus. It's a great organization.
Well said. Thank you, sir. So when we go back, and it's hard to believe that it's barely been 2 weeks, conventional wisdom is that the advance of HTS really took people by surprise. Do you concur with that, or was perhaps there was more advance notice than conventional wisdom believes?
Well, Jim, there was no advance notice of what was originally a Turkish-supported move by the HTS outside of the Idlib enclave, an enclave of some 3 million people, most of them displaced from other parts of Syria over the course of the last years of the civil war, including militias, which had been evacuated from various parts of Syria to this concentration point. That enclave had come under significant fire, both artillery and airstrikes in recent weeks, and the move was designed to relieve that pressure. What happened then was the transformation of a tactical move, which admittedly was opportunistic. It took advantage of the diminution of Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia, but it was never contemplated that this would result in 12 short days with the overthrow of a regime which had lasted for 54 years.
I was talking to someone earlier this morning who was at the Doha conference, and he remarked that there were several panels on addressing Syria and how to bring Syria back into sort of the community of nations.
Yeah. Look, the profound character of what has happened in the Middle East, not just the Syrian events, which are themselves a reflection of the extraordinary events of the last several months, the literal decimation of Hezbollah's leadership, the significant degradation of Hezbollah's military capacities in Lebanon, the Russian both inability and, I think, lack of political will, given the war in Ukraine, to engage in another foreign military adventure with significant force commitments. And then finally, the extraordinary impact of the last Israeli air operation over Iran with respect to the political messaging that operation provided, which is that Iran is vulnerable, completely vulnerable, and that it ought not in its own interests engage in provocative behaviors. These all combined to make what happened in Syria possible, and it's a good thing. We can talk about where things go from here for the region in Syria, but the ouster of this murderous criminal clique is a positive event for the region, for the United States, and of course, for Syrians.
And let me remind everyone that we will be taking questions throughout the program, so send them in. I already see that Ray Termini has one. We'll get to that in a minute. Were you surprised, and were others surprised, that the Syrian Assad's army just melted away?
I have to say, we knew in an analytical fashion how hollow this regime was. It was less a regime, less a government than a criminal gang engaged in narcotics manufacturing and mass trafficking as a way of supporting itself that had predated upon the Syrian people for a half century plus. We knew all of that. What we did not know was that, in fact, neither Russia nor Iran and its Hezbollah associate would intervene at all. Because had they intervened, this could have been a very different story.
I'd like to ask the World Affairs Council to pull up the map right now, because it is confusing about who all the parties are. And I wonder if you might just take a minute or two to help us walk through this map.
Absolutely. Let's start with the group which has over much of Syria, but not all, assumed control. It calls itself Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, the Organization for the Liberation of Syria. It began as al-Nusra, literally a Syrian version of al-Qaeda. That organization was correctly labeled a foreign terrorist organization by the United States and many others in the international community. Its fighters were jihadis. They engaged in actions which fully justify that terrorist label. But over the course of the 13 years of civil war, from 2011 to present, the fighters from that organization and many other jihadi groups were compressed into the area in northwest Syria around Idlib, right up against the Turkish border. Those groups eventually all fell under the overall control of HTS, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, and its leader, Mohammed al-Jolani. His real name, which he is now using, is Ahmed Ashara. So the question now is, what other groups challenge for control? There are two separate militias in southern Syria, adjacent to the Jordanian border, one in Dara, one between Dara and Damascus, largely composed of Druze fighters who have taken control in the last days of the Assad regime. And then we get to the very confused picture in the northeast and the north. The areas on your map in orange are controlled right now by Turkish-backed militias, the so-called Syrian National Army. It is not a jihadist group. It is very secular. It is very much a proxy of Turkey. Its primary objective is not and was not the Assad regime. It is the Kurdish self-declared autonomous entity in northeast Syria, in yellow, labeled as U.S.-backed Kurdish forces. Why are there U.S.-backed Kurdish forces? Well, in 2015, 2016, as the U.S. was pursuing the defeat of ISIS in its final redoubts in northeast Syria along the Euphrates Valley, we required an ally to work with us. The only ally available were the Kurds, the so-called YPG, the People's Protective Units. We're very clear about who the YPG are. They are the Syrian branch of the PKK, a U.S.-designated foreign terrorist organization. But with eyes open, we partnered with that group to achieve the greater aim of the end to the ISIS presence, or at least the elimination of the caliphate. ISIS remains very active in eastern Syria. It is not wholly eliminated. And the allies we have, the partners we have in the Kurdish militia, have been active in assisting us. We only have 900 personnel in all of northeast Syria in conducting that fight. They also, Jim, do something else which is extremely important. Those forces, with our support, control two facilities, a prison camp in extreme northeast Syria with some 8,000 foreign terrorist fighters, ISIS, as well as a detention facility with some 40,000, largely Syrian and Iraqi dependents, associates of those foreign terrorist fighters, who are themselves now regarded in significant numbers as very dangerous. The United States does not wish to see those fighters, those dependents, released into Syria, where they would undoubtedly rejoin the pockets of ISIS presence in eastern Syria and regenerate, not as a speculative matter, but as a certainty, a significant ISIS challenge. So we continue to want to see those Kurdish or that Kurdish militia able to continue to partner with us. Turkey, however, has been determined for many years to secure a zone some 20 kilometers plus deep along its entire border with Syria. You see on your map there, those portions in orange, they indicate areas already under Turkish and Turkish militia control. Turkey is now moving, or is expected to move imminently, against the area that joins Manbij with what is labeled as Tel Abyad on your map. The U.S. position on this is there should be no further disruption, fighting in Syria after the fall of the regime. As a matter of fact, though, if the Turks and their militia move, the U.S. role will be to negotiate a ceasefire which minimizes civilian casualties and the evacuation of Kurdish fighters and those who wish to leave from that area. We will seek to preserve the ability of the SDF and YPG to partner with us, but we do respect, and we've been very clear on this, Turkish rights to self-defense of its own border.
Indeed, it is complicated. You've done a marvelous job of explaining it. Just a few hours ago, President-elect Trump had a press conference, and in that press conference, he described the situation as an unfriendly takeover orchestrated by Turkey, and then he added, "Turkey holds the key." And if that's the case, what leverage do we have with Turkey?
Jim, let's be clear here. What happened was not, in any sense, a Turkish takeover of Syria. It was a group which had Turkish support, but a group which was composed of Syrian fighters. We have concerns about their jihadi character. We've made those very clear, but it was an act of will on the part of Syrian groups, and the hollowness of the criminal Assad regime, which resulted in what has happened. With respect to the north, that is indeed a Turkish decision. We don't want to see the Turks put our Kurdish associates, partners, in a position where they will not, cannot, continue to partner with us in the fight against ISIS and the maintenance of those two facilities. That's absolutely correct. Critical goal for us. But does Turkey control Syria? No, it does not. And indeed, the question now for the region, for Syrians, for us, is what happens next? What happens next, meaning, does the organization which al-Jolani, Bashar, now directs, is it able to maintain its coherency, its cohesiveness? Now that victory has been achieved, are there centrifugal forces which overwhelm the centripetal force when they were in an enclave seeking victory? Now, that's been the experience of many groups like this over the course of the Middle East history. If that happens, then the great fear of the region is there will be not a partitioning, that's too formal a term, but rather the assumption of practical control of disparate groups who may be more or less moderate, more or less jihadi. And those groups pose a very significant challenge, that fragmentation of control over Syria to everyone. Ultimately, they pose a challenge to Turkey as well, but certainly to all of Syria's neighbors, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq.
What about the Alawites? And that's really was the clan that supported President Assad. Were they very involved with the administration of the country, holding high positions and the institutions? Are they needed? And how will al-Shara bring them in?
Great question. The Alawites are a religious minority in Syria. They are an offshoot or a subsect of Shia Islam. They composed the ranks of the leadership of the regime that took power between 1963 and then ultimately the Assad family's assumption of full control in 1970. That Assad regime, father and son, was identified not incorrectly as an Alawite regime. Now, they brought in Sunnis, they brought in Christians very deliberately as a way of bolstering their Syrian national credentials, just as they had a fatwa arranged that proclaimed them to be Sunni Muslims, a rather extraordinary step, as they sought authenticity and legitimacy. But there is a grave concern that there will be a turning against the Alawites in revenge for this 54-year plus oppressive, brutal regime. That would be a very disastrous outcome. Jolani, Bashar, has said that is not the intent, that there will be no bloodletting, no secret seeking of revenge. But how much control does he have at the ground level against those seeking to avenge the deaths of their family members? The horrible images coming out of Sednaya prison. All of that is going to inspire a desire to get back, and the Alawites will be very much potential victims of this.
Let's talk about the sanctions, something that you have considerable experience with. Syria is one of the a country that probably has as many sanctions as any other country, probably competing somewhat with Russia now. When should those sanctions be mitigate or decreased? And one of the things that I'm curious about is some of the sanctions can be removed by executive order, but others are going to, I believe, require congressional action.
Absolutely, Jim, you're quite correct. The administration's made very clear, Jake Sullivan and Tony Blinken, in the course of their travels in the Middle East over this last week, that we will judge this new controlling entity, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, not by its rhetoric, which is fine, but by its actions. And it's the actions which will determine what next steps we take with respect to sanctions and other measures. And I think that position is reflected by the bulk of the international community. All of them will wish to be, as we are, in contact with the organization. That's extremely important. And the sanctions don't bar such diplomatic contact. But lifting of sanctions, that will be a product of what actions take place. And I'll just note here, the experience of Afghanistan colors what next steps are taken by any administration towards a group like this. No one wishes in the joy over the overthrow of a horrific tyrannical regime to ignore the potential for oppression of minorities, of women, and not just minorities outside Islam, but minorities within Islam, the Alawites in particular, Shia in general. We need to see what they do first.
While the HTS has been repressive, they have been rather open to having women attending school and holding positions, medical positions, et cetera, being in administration. Is that not true?
It is largely correct, but there has also been some application of aspects of Sharia law in the Idlib enclave. Well, they're not in an enclave anymore.
Mm-hmm.
They're in Damascus, which is a quite cosmopolitan city, significant Christian population, Alawite population, Sunni Muslim population, and Druze. What do they now do? So again, I don't wish to condemn in advance the group, but to say there will be exceeding watchfulness of actual steps taken on the ground. And we will be looking at treatment of women, treatment of minorities, as opposed to engagement in acts of terror. That's important. But how they behave towards their own people at this point is perhaps even more important.
Let me bring in one of our viewers, Bisma Ikram, asks, what concerns do you have regarding the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, being in southwestern Syria? And I would just add that there have been over 450 actions by Israel in Syria since December 8th.
I'll give a general comment first.
Mm-hmm.
The administration has said that it supports and understands the actions taken by Israel against the military assets, conventional and non-conventional research facilities, potential CW and other WMD stocks and related equipment. It understands it as a self-defensive measure. The administration has also said that it understands the formal Israeli position that with respect to their physical presence in the buffer zone previously held by UNDOF, the UN Disengagement and Observer Force on the Golan frontier, that is temporary, that Israel does not regard the 1974 disengagement agreement as voided, but as there is no controlling authority on the other side of that agreement, they have taken these measures for defensive reasons. That said, and I think those positions by the administration are quite correct, it is important that Israel, when it has eliminated the capacities of the former regime, lest they fall into the hands of violent jihadi groups, it's important that they allow Syria to develop in whatever peace, relative or not, a Syrian governance, Syrian people's wills, plural, dictate and not become a factor themselves in the equation in terms of destabilizing the state.
Now, Israel just recently announced, or rather the government of Benjamin Netanyahu said that hoped to double the number of settlers in the Golan. Is that in a way a situation where Israel is more concerned now by the devil they don't know, where in a sense they
Uh,
felt more secure by having the Assad regime?
First, Jim, I would note that that declaration of doubling the number of settlers in Golan has been repeated by a variety of Israeli prime ministers over much of the last 25 or 30 years. The number of settlers has not doubled. I would see that as politically performative rather than directive in terms of its substance. But do they fear what will happen now? Yes, they certainly do. They're very concerned. Israel's had an experience, as has Jordan, of what has happened during parts of the Syrian civil war, in which a very violent, very lethal jihadi group settled itself in an area right on the Jordanian and southern half of the Golan Heights frontier. This was a real problem for both Israel and Jordan. I think neither state wishes to see a replication of it. Israel is concerned, but the debate in the Israeli security community since the civil war broke out in 2011, Assad or the opposition or Assad, which is better for Israel? That debate went back and forth. Ultimately, Israel is better off, I believe, minus a regime which was the active, legitimizing patron and anchor for the Iranian and Hezbollah presence in Syria.
And certainly when you look at what's, as you mentioned a minute ago, those images from the prisons, that underscores what you've said.
No one should be equivocal about the fall of this regime.
I want to go back to your discussion, your remarks about ISIS a minute ago, and we could almost have a World Affairs Council debate between Ambassador Robert Ford and Charles Lister, who had an article in the New York Times. Ford, a few days ago, talking to our sister World Affairs Council of Seattle, believes that the 1,000 troops that we have, approximately 1,000 troops, should be withdrawn. Lister says ISIS continues, while diffuse continues to be a threat. Could you comment a little bit more about what ISIS motivations are and to the degree that they are a threat?
ISIS has continued to maintain some 5 ink spots, if you will, bases of operation throughout the very remote Syrian eastern desert. It was those islets, those spots, those concentrations, which the U.S. very heavily bombed, struck a few days ago, as the U.S., like Israel, pursued those forces, those elements of forces, which we saw as potentially threatening. What does ISIS want? It wants precisely what it wanted when it first emerged, which is to establish a caliphate across the Middle East, because it does not regard any secular government, doesn't even regard Islamic governments other than its definition of Islam as legitimate. That's what it wants. And I have no doubt, were it ever to regain the capacity to do so, would attempt to replicate the activities in Iraq, in Syria, that it did some years ago. It remains a significant threat. Those 900 forces are at present a key to sustaining the ability and the willingness of our Kurdish partners to control those 2 facilities. That's a delicate balancing act, because those are the same forces which a NATO ally, Turkey, a critical ally, regards as terrorist in their basic identity and threatening to Turkey. We understand that. It is a balancing act, not a perfectly squarable circle, which we have pursued since 2015. It is in our interest to pursue it, at least until we know more clearly what the future of Syria looks like. And that would be my advice, whether it was a Harris, Biden second term, or Trump administration. Don't act precipitately to withdraw those forces.
Where is ISIS getting its support now?
ISIS gets its support from the taxes it levies against those populations it still controls. It gets donations from a regional and trans-regional network of money changers and exchangers who, through couriers, bring money into the desert, into those places where ISIS is still operative. Despite all the sanctions, despite all of the asset control measures we, our partners in the region and beyond have, it is still possible through these exchange networks, the hawalas, to be able to move monies in.
And the weapons?
The weapons are largely still the weapons that they kept with them when they moved to the desert. Certainly some weapons may have been acquired from withdrawing Syrian regime forces during the course of the civil war, but largely they are what they had with them. It is money that has come to them as opposed to weaponry. Yet they do have a kinetic capacity, which is why the U.S. struck so heavily as it did a few days ago.
Many would argue that a mistake that the United States was involved in Iraq was the decapitation of the Ba'ath Party and soldiers and military folks losing their jobs.
It was a horrific mistake, the original sin, if you will.
So, having said that, with Israel essentially knocking out the Syrian assets, is that not following that same model?
I don't think it's opposite. The difference here is that Israel is not striking out against HTS. It hasn't targeted individuals at all. Its fear is that advanced weapons facilities, large stocks of conventional weaponry, naval, air, ground assets, will fall into the hands not necessarily of Ahmed Bashar and his own led groups, but more radical, more violent groups who will use them against Israel or against other neighbors in the region. And frankly, that is a concern I cannot gainsay.
Here's an interesting question from Patrick Talamentes. As the director of the Baker Institute, where journalist Austin Tice won the 2022 James Baker Prize for Excellence in Leadership, you're well aware of Austin's detention. What would you say to his family about why how various administrations haven't done more to secure his release, and what can be done now to find him?
Jim, I have been directly involved, not in the Tice affair as much as in the case of other families whose loved ones have disappeared in the Lebanese civil war, the Israeli invasion in the 1980s, and in other conflicts. And I understand their feelings. I would say this. I believe all U.S. administrations, since Tice was first taken and disappeared, have done everything in their power to achieve his release, to try to verify if he is in fact living or dead. It is not a question of failure to exercise appropriate pressures or levers. It is the difficulty in dealing in a situation in a place like Syria, where the regime denies it holds the individual, and where, to be very frank, the U.S. government possesses neither proof of life nor proof of death. What we do in these circumstances is assume the individual is alive. That's our obligation. And we pursue the case until it becomes clear that is not the case, or the individual is located. That's the case for Austin Tice. And so I am not willing to indict any U.S. administration for failure to act. These are frustrating, emotional, difficult cases. In some, they extend over decades. Some never achieve resolution. Some do only very late. But no administration has failed to act when an action was possible.
I'd like to switch gears just for a little bit, and then we'll come back to Syria. But you had such an important position regarding Gaza. Bring us up to date where we are there, and do you see any movement that may happen prior to January 20th?
Jim, first let me talk about the potential for what is the absolute foundational point for any day after in Gaza, any better options for the future of Gaza and its people. And that is a ceasefire with release of hostages. And the two are linked, absolutely. No ceasefire without release of hostages. Release of hostages will require a ceasefire. We are closer at this moment today than we have been since November of last year, 13 months ago. And that is a product of one thing only, that Hamas, looking around at the region, now appears to recognize it has not only seen its own leadership decapitated with Sinwar's death, but has seen Hezbollah and Iran essentially taken off the battlefield. There's going to be no regional war, no broad conflict which will advantage Hamas. That's gone. And the fall of Assad's regime certainly was the crowning blow in this new reality Hamas must accept. So we are, all of us, hopeful that in the very near future, the ceasefire and at least initial release of hostages, including American hostages, and there are living American hostages, can take place. That is why you've seen Brett McGurk, Tony Blinken, Jake Sullivan traveling as intensively as they have in the region. It is to try to bring this to closure. And it's something where, if I may say so, there is no daylight between the Biden presidency and the government to come into power in January. Everyone wants to see this done as quickly as possible. But now I will turn to the situation, humanitarian situation in Gaza. At best, at last week of April, first week of May this year, at best, we, the United States, the international humanitarian community, NGOs, the UN family, were able to move enough assistance to prevent starvation and famine. That is a very low bar, and I do not regard it as a bar which signals in any way success. It was a failure, and I'm quite outspoken about that. But we did prevent famine and starvation. We met that minimal goal with the initiation in the end of the first week of May of Israel's Rafah campaign. We didn't just face a downward slope in ability to deliver, distribute assistance. It fell off a cliff, and it has only partially recovered in what is now 7 months plus since then. The last few days, literally the last 5 days, have seen an encouraging increase in the amount of assistance which can be distributed to persons in need in Gaza. But preceding that, we were functioning at levels that were at times 0, 10%, 15%, certainly no better than 20% of the levels of assistance that were being distributed in Gaza at the end of April, beginning of May. That is disastrous. The president has used the term hellish, living hell, to describe Gaza. He's absolutely correct. It is a humanitarian disaster of unprecedented character globally because of the concentration of people 100% dependent for everything, shelter, food, medical care, water, in a very, very small area. Sudan is disastrous. Yemen is disastrous. Yes, and I don't denigrate from that. The Rohingya all suffer very significant challenges, but they are not concentrated with nowhere to go, no place to escape as they are in Gaza. It is desperate. And we are working as intensively as we can, private sector, public sector, to try to alleviate this. Some progress, yes, very recently, but boy, it has to be tripled and quadrupled to make an impact now. There are parts of northern Gaza with admittedly smaller populations which have effectively received no assistance since beginning of October this year. 2 months plus now, no assistance. That's not acceptable. And our messaging to our Israeli partners, we understand the Hamas challenge. There should be no doubt about that. Hamas has agency. They have elected not to agree for over a year to a ceasefire that could end this fighting. They continue to have a military capacity which fights and kills Israelis. They're not eliminated, but nevertheless, there is a fundamental humanitarian responsibility here, which is incumbent upon Israel.
What a mountain, though, for the international community to climb to try to help rebuild some of these communities. The World Bank just recently said it would take $400 million to rebuild the infrastructure in Syria. I've seen estimates that it'll take 80 years to rebuild Gaza. Will the
Jim,
can the international community respond?
I was asked many times, what about the day after in Gaza? My answer, and it was not just disingenuous, was let's get to a day before first, a day before that permits a realistic consideration of stabilization and reconstruction. Now, that day before requires absolutely a ceasefire, an enduring ceasefire. It requires something else too. It requires a political horizon, a political vision. You are not going to get, as a statement of fact, significant Gulf or other Arab participation or Egyptian participation in stabilization efforts, in reopening Rafah terminal, in reconstruction. You're not going to get that unless there is an expression of support from the government of Israel for a political framework, a political horizon, which, and the words can be negotiated, essentially says a credible pathway to a negotiated permanent status resolution between Palestinians and Israel. That may be hard to say. It may be very difficult for many Israelis, maybe even most Israelis, to palate right now. But without it, you won't get to a day before, and the day after will be more misery, desperation for Israel above all, as well as the Palestinians.
Ray Termini has a question, and Ray, since you're watching, I know you've had several questions about Israel. If we've not adequately responded to those, just send a note to me. But this question is, will Russia lose its key military bases in post-Assad Syria? How important are they to Russia, and will they lose them?
I'll answer the second part first. They're very important to Russia, and their importance goes beyond Syria. They are the naval and the air bases which support the Russian adventure, military, militia adventure in all of Africa, the Wagner group of great ill fame. If they lose those bases, if they withdraw from those bases, that will be a blow. It's not an irreparable one. Russia has other facilities in Libya that could be used for this purpose, unfortunately. But to have to close out those bases in Syria will be a major reputational blow, and they will have an operational impact. Now, the first part, are they in the process of losing them? Can't say. The Russian naval assets that were in Tartus base have withdrawn to positions in the Eastern Med off the coast. They're not in port right now. There has been some movement. You've seen it reported in the press of Russian force elements and sophisticated equipment out of Khmeimim Air Base, but I don't think we can spell the complete end of that presence quite yet.
Does Russia, or where does Russia have presence now in the Middle East that is significant? They've really been pushed out, haven't they?
Well, in terms of basing facilities, it is the naval port at Tartus, the airfield at Khmeimim on the Syrian western coast, and then a variety of facilities, numerous facilities in eastern Syria, in the area controlled by so-called Field Marshal Khalifa Haftar.
So one of our young viewers, Beckett Potter, has asked a very broad question. And Beckett, I'm going to ask the ambassador to really focus on Iran. Does this create what's happened in Syria as new opportunities for some type of improved relations with Iran, or the opposite?
Great question. My own view is that the incoming administration faces an opportunity which the Iranians may not respond to in satisfactory manner, but an opportunity to do several things. First and foremost, to bring an end to the firing from the last standing active Iranian proxy, the Houthi militia in Yemen, which has fired upon international shipping, U.S. and other naval vessels attempting to protect shipping in the southern Red Sea. 65% of the revenues to Egypt, major source of foreign currency for Egypt, from the Suez Canal have been lost because of this. That has had a disastrous impact on a critical partner in the Middle East. But Iran should not be given the liberty, the freedom to continue to have a militia they supply, they equip, they train, predate international maritime shipping, innocent passage any longer. And I think the opportunities for the next administration to clearly message that that will not be tolerated in an Iran which understands now it is completely vulnerable. It can be struck anywhere at any time and has virtually no ability to defend itself. Now's the moment to bring an end to this last example of international projected terror supported by Iran. First opportunity. Second opportunity, the nuclear program. The next administration will have numerous options to pursue, and I can't speak for it. I don't know which course they will choose, but signals coming out for many months now, even preceding for Iran the disasters of the last several months, has been a desire to try to enter into some form of New Deal. The challenge here is that the New Deal certainly cannot be a replication of the JCPOA. It will have to include commitments on the ballistic missiles program, as well as Iran's threatening, unacceptable behaviors. Is Iran willing to do that? Don't know. But Iran is in a position now where I think it is very much worth a significant challenge to see just how much could be done through negotiation and carefully applied pressure.
You believe that there are back channel discussions going on now between the United States and Iran, or perhaps France or another ally?
Can't comment, Jim. I just don't know with any certainty.
So Hamas and Hezbollah certainly have been weakened. What about the Houthis? Because that still is a significant threat in the Red Sea and the Suez Canal. And incoming President Trump has said he's certainly going to take some action there.
And I certainly believe he should. The Houthis are riding high, and they are the last standing. And look, Hezbollah is not eliminated. Let's be very clear here. They retain significant weaponry. They're a significant presence still in Lebanon, but they have suffered major reversals, which have compelled them to accept the ceasefire of late November. The Houthis are under no such sets of compulsions. I would argue strongly in U.S. interests, they need to be.
And as we go around the map, the country that we've not really talked about yet is Lebanon. Poor Lebanon.
Yes, poor Lebanon. Nabi Berri, the Speaker of Parliament, one of the leaders of the Shia community, has announced there will be a presidential electoral session convened on January 9th. Will that session, that's less than a month from now, elect a president? Well, I have been in Lebanon on and off for much of the last 43 years, and I have seen presidential election sessions come and go. But I will say this, while I can't predict if a president will be elected, I can tell you, if there is no president, there will be no major international assistance, reconstruction, support coming for Lebanon. If I could deliver that message in harsher terms, I would do so. And it is the same message which the government of France has delivered, which the international financial institutions, the bank, the IMF have delivered. Without a president, a credible president, you're not going to get anything. So poor Lebanon, yes. But the Lebanese elites have an opportunity now to take a decision which is not wholly self-interested for the sake of the Lebanese people. Will they do so? We certainly hope. If they don't, this is only going to get worse for the people of Lebanon.
Important message. I hope they hear you. Let's talk about the refugees. How large is the Syrian diaspora worldwide and in the United States?
There are about 6.5 to 7 million Syrians who have been internally displaced.
Mhm.
There is about that same number who have been externally displaced. About 1.5 million to Europe, the majority in Germany, who were welcomed by Angela Merkel. About currently a little over 2 million in Turkey. The numbers were much higher several years ago, but 2 million, 2.5 million in Turkey. There is about 800,000. There are about 800,000 in Lebanon now. There were higher numbers. Many of them returned to Syria because of the Israel-Hezbollah fighting. About that same number, 700, 800,000 in Jordan, and a relatively small number in the United States.
And I guess it's a term of art. I use the word diaspora, but we also have the refugees.
I'm speaking of the refugee community.
Right.
Yes.
And so
the diaspora is much, much larger.
right. And very wealthy in the United States. And
Indeed, they are.
Do you think, and have you had discussions with them, many are in Houston, have you had discussions about their support, and are they able and willing to put in some of the charitable donations that are going to be needed?
Too soon to say. I think the events of the last 2 weeks have come so swiftly that many are waiting to see if we put money into Syria, to whom is it going? For what kind of Syria? And let's go back to where we started this discussion, Jim. We don't know with certainty what the character of governance in Syria will be. Unitary, fragmented, jihadi, non-jihadi, both at the same time. People are waiting. They're waiting to return in many cases, and they're waiting to put their money in until they see what the new Syria looks like.
You know, there was an article that was in the Financial Times over the weekend, and it cautioned the Syrians to not be too impatient. And you and I talked earlier about Tunisia. Tunisians woke up now over a decade ago thinking that everything would be fine. The next day they'd have employment and the economy would soar. How do we help the Syrians realize that this is a long process?
It is by engagement. And as I said, the administration and our partners are already talking to the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, trying to determine what they want, but also making clear what our expectations are of any new government in Syria. And this is not a Western or U.S. our expectations. It's the region's expectations. They want to see stability. They want to see a Syria which is not radical Islamist in its direction. Those are goals, and with them can come, if they're achieved, very significant support. The Gulf won't want to see the Emirates, the Saudis, a destabilized Syria, a desperate Syrian population seeking to flee, nor will Europe. They will want to invest in a different kind of Syria. The Turks, above all, want to see a Syria to which those 2 million plus refugees can return. But they must return. They'll only return, whether from Germany, from Turkey, from Lebanon, from Jordan. They're not only going to return if they feel they can come back to safety, to jobs, to homes, to a country in which they can make their lives.
And that takes time. You know, one thing that I remarked when I was watching some of the demonstrations in Damascus and Aleppo and elsewhere is you saw women. And you didn't see that in some of the other protests throughout the Arab world.
The Assad regime was many things, but it did not, largely speaking, discriminate against women in the same sense that Islamist regimes had done. So there's a potential here, but it's potential that has to be realized by the new government. And if we start seeing reports of women being cautioned to cover themselves, to adopt Islamist practices in public, if we start seeing segregation of women in the workplace, this is not going to go well for international support. It's not going to go well for Syria.
And the thumb will remain to be on the sanctions if that's
You
the
bet. Absolutely.
So we're winding near the end of our hour together, and one of our attendees asks, what prospect for any progress on the Abraham Accords in the new U.S. administration?
Great question. And the answer is, boy, is it doable. It is even doable in the theoretical, in the days remaining to the Biden administration. I'm not exaggerating here. It is absolutely achievable. Extraordinary work has been done over the course of the past year to set the stage, but it requires one fundamental element. Just as a day before in Gaza requires a commitment, a meaningful commitment, accompanied by actions by Israel, by this government of Israel, to a credible pathway to a negotiated permanent status resolution. That's what the Saudi deal requires as well. Will Prime Minister Netanyahu do it? Will he utter the words? Will he take the actions necessary to show that the words have meaning? That's a question only he can answer, but I can tell you and your listeners, it is possible.
Don't you think, though, that all those type of actions are going to not happen until after January 20th? Won't Prime Minister Netanyahu want to do this as a gift to the new president, incoming president?
I will cite here Senator Lindsey Graham. Lindsey believes the best moment for the deal is between January 3rd and January 20th, because that's when you have a new Congress, Republican majority, but not enough Republican senators to pass what will amount to a treaty because of the security assurances being offered to Saudi Arabia. That you want it done at a time when President Biden can support and encourage Democrats in the Senate to vote for this measure as good for the United States, good for the region, good for all concerned. And the answer is, it is good for all concerned. And it is another major step in constraining not just Iran, but the People's Republic of China, which is one of the other focuses of that agreement.
Well, Ambassador, you know that our friend Ryan Crocker often ends a program on the Middle East by saying, if you think today is bad, tomorrow will be worse. You have given us some optimism, which is a nice way to begin the holidays. Thanks so much for spending time.
I'm disturbed by ever entering any briefing, ending any briefing I do, by not saying, in the Middle East, behind every silver lining lies a cloud. But I do see significant opportunities here. Yes, I do. Happy holidays to all of you.
Well, thank you. And to all of you in our audience today, thank you so much for being with us. And Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, and we'll see you next year. Have a great day.